Welcome to the Good Faith Podcast. I'm David French with Curtis Chang. And, well, listeners, I have good news for you. We have a break from the last week or so where it was just Curtis and me talking to each other. We have a great guest, another guest that Curtis has brought in. But this time, I know the guest as well. So although Curtis brought him in, I'm going to share 10% credit, Curtis.
Okay, you get 10% credit.
I get 10% credit, but I'm really excited about our guest. Curtis, do you want to introduce David?
I do, and I want to do a bit of a lengthy introduction by way of starting with the observation that every Christian should be taught a prayer by Jesus himself, which is, of course, the Lord's Prayer. And central to the Lord's Prayer is this prayer, this line, "Forgive us our debts as we forgive our debtors." That is the version from Matthew 6. Now, again, some Christians have been taught to say, "Forgive us our trespasses" or "Forgive us our sins." But the Matthew 6 version, which is the longer version of the Lord's Prayer, almost all biblical translations have it correct, I think, as translating it to "about debts." Forgive us our debts as we forgive our debtors. So that according to Jesus, an understanding of debt and debt forgiveness is actually central to how we relate to God and how we relate to other people. But, if we don't really grasp the nature of debt, it means we're not grasping sort of the most important prayer that Jesus taught us. And I think in actuality, many Christians don't grasp the full meaning of debt and debt forgiveness, and therefore miss out on the full meaning of this most important prayer that we're taught. So our guest today has been a person that has helped me grasp the fuller meanings of debt and debt forgiveness, and that's David Skeel. David, welcome to the Good Faith Podcast.
Thanks so much, Curtis. It's really wonderful to join you.
And the reason that David has taught me about debt is not that he owes me money, at least not that I'm aware of anyways. It's that...
I probably do, but...
yeah, maybe. I think I picked up breakfast last time. I think the next one's on you, David. So no, David Skeel is one of the world's leading expert on the legal framework around debt and debt forgiveness, particular bankruptcy, which is a key way that our law structures debt forgiveness. He wrote one of the defining legal histories of debt in America called Debt's Dominion, and is widely recognized. And partly because he's a world expert on debt, he is really not only taught and thought about debt, but he's also influenced how an important part of our world handles debt. Now, I'm going to talk about that in a moment, but he's done so with great thoughtfulness as a Christian. He is somebody that I met through the Veritas RIF program that I've talked about before, and that has been the source of a few of our previous guests. And so what I love about David is because he's so thoughtful as a Christian. He's obviously an expert in the law. And in addition to that, in the last 6 years, he's not just been a thinker about debt and debt forgiveness, he's been a doer. So back in 2016, President Obama appointed David Skeel, our guest, to the Fiscal Control Board. This is a very powerful body that was given authority to restructure a huge debt problem in the American body politic, which is specifically the crushing debt load on Puerto Rico. And it's an issue that gets very little attention in sort of popular understanding, but actually is a very important issue in how Americans handle our affairs. And so we're going to talk about all of that, about the big issues of the spiritual and legal understandings of debt and forgiveness, about Puerto Rico, about how one does law and properly applies faith convictions to the exercise of law and public policy. So we've got a wide-ranging set of topics, but I want to begin by giving our listeners a glimpse into you, David Skeel, into you, the person. And I want to invite you to just kind of introduce yourself by way of sort of sharing how you came to faith and how Christianity still resonates with you in your life and in your thinking, especially.
Absolutely. Thanks, Curtis, for the kind introduction. And I'll try to make my answer to your question less than the rest of the time we have, and shortened a little bit. But how I became a Christian, how I embraced Christianity, really began in college. My parents had both been in church-going families, but they stopped going to church, and we essentially never went to church when I was a kid. I was inside of a church maybe 3 or 4 times in the first 18 years of my life. We were not even Christmas and Easter Christians, which was sort of unusual back then. So I got to college, and I was a literature major, and I immediately started encountering lots of biblical references in the things that we were reading. And because I had never been to church and didn't know anything about the Bible, I didn't have a clue what those literature references were. And the straw that broke the camel's back for me was one day in my literature class, we were talking about a well-known mid-20th century short story by somebody named Wright Morris that was called The Ram in the Thicket. And as anybody who went to Sunday school as a kid would know, Ram in the Thicket is a reference to the story of Abraham and Isaac in Genesis, where Abraham is told to bring Isaac to be sacrificed, it appears. But at the last minute, God provides a ram that is stuck in the thicket to be the substitutionary sacrifice.
By the way, that is a passage that no preacher wants to be assigned to preach on in the lectionary. So.
Well, and I'm glad you're the theologian here. So if there are any questions that come up, you can handle. I could talk about that as well. I had to write something about that one time and got some pushback for interpreting it in a distinctively Christian way. But we talked about that story in class. I had no idea what the references were. I didn't recognize them even when they were explained to us. And I concluded at that point that the Bible might be just a crock, but it might be just a bunch of mythology. It might not make any sense, but I needed to at least read it. And so the summer after my sophomore year of college, I and 2 friends were driving across the country to go kind of find ourselves out west. And we had this van that we got through one of the world's worst ever business ideas. In the business, the company was called Drive Away. Do you either of y'all remember?
No, but it sounds awful. But go, what is it?
No, but I'm curious.
To somebody, I think it sounded like a good idea. And the idea was, if somebody was moving across the country or needed to move a vehicle a long distance and didn't have the time to drive it themselves, they would contact this company, and this company would find people who would drive the vehicle. And the people that they found tended to be sophomores in college who were spending their summer finding themselves. So we had this van that we were given by Drive Away to deliver in Las Vegas. And we had, I think, 10 days or something like that to get it to Las Vegas. We did deliver it to Las Vegas. It sort of looked the same when it got to Las Vegas, but I'm quite confident it was not the same van anymore. We drove it 24 hours at a time, and we drove it kind of hard. But while we were
David,
driving,
you're costing us a potential sponsorship with Drive Away to the podcast right now.
Well, fortunately, they ceased to exist. I think about 20 years ago, probably about a year after we drove them out west. But while we took turns driving in this van to Las Vegas, and when it wasn't my turn to drive, I would sit in the back of the van, and I just started reading the Bible. And by the time I was really had not even finished Genesis, it was clear to me it was true. I mean, I just had never read anything remotely like this that was so psychologically true to my experience. I really felt like it explained myself to myself. And my journey as a Christian had a number of steps after that, but that was really the beginning. The beginning was just reading the Bible and reading this. This isn't like the literature that I know. This is true. And it's been a pretty crazy, winding journey since then. And in fact, when I'm still close with one of the people who was on that trip, who was not a Christian at the time, who became a Christian much, much later through a remarkable series of events. When he hears me tell this story, he laughs. He says, "You considered yourself to be a Christian in college?" we never would have guessed that. That was back when the drinking age was 18. So the journey had lots of steps in it, but that really was the beginning. For me, it was just reading the Bible.
Well, we overlapped briefly at the same church, 10th Presbyterian Church in Center City, Philadelphia, when I was president of FIRE, Foundation for Individual Rights and Education at the time, now Foundation for Individual Rights and Expression, and you were at Penn. I think we might have just brushed into each other at that point, but we've met a couple of times. And one thing that I think is an interesting part of the story, and if you could sort of lay out, is so you're an expert in bankruptcy law. And one of the interesting things I think, and some of I know we have some law student listeners, a lot of times Christian law students will sort of feel like, well, I need to go into an area of law that's Christian-y, whether it's, religious liberty law or pro-life, or you're talking about looking for a job at International Justice Mission or something like that. You became a world-leading expert in bankruptcy law. And I love that. I love that because one of the things that I talk to Christian law students about is, do not think of that because you're a Christian law student that there's a certain specific career path for you, that there's a need for salt and light across the entire spectrum of the American culture, the American economy, American life. And so how did you end up in bankruptcy law?
I ended up in bankruptcy for reasons completely other than my faith, consistent with what you just said, or so I thought. Mm-hmm. The way I ended up doing bankruptcy is in my first year of law school, I had a bunch of quite good professors, but I had two spectacular professors. And I decided at the end of law school that whatever those professors taught for my remaining 2 years of law school, I was going to take it. So I came into law school, as we've already been talking about, as a literature person, a poetry person, had no interest in business law as well. But I found myself in this bankruptcy class because this spectacular law professor was teaching it my second year of law school. And I love to say this because it sounds so incongruous to people, but I fell in love with bankruptcy. And the reason that I fell in love with it is twofold. First, I had never realized just how important bankruptcy is to American history. So that if you go back through the 19th century and you ask the question, what were the most important issues in American life in the 19th century? Not just 1 or 2 years, but across the entire century. Obviously, number one, you would say, was slavery and the slavery issue. But there's a pretty good argument bankruptcy was number two. And every major player in American life had a very strong stand on the issue, should we have a federal bankruptcy law or not. So, and Alexander Hamilton, who people didn't used to know, but all know now, thanks to Lin-Manuel Miranda, a Puerto Rican, I will mention. Alexander Hamilton was a big proponent of a federal bankruptcy law. He thought it was essential to becoming a commercial nation, which he thought we needed to be. Jefferson was on exactly the opposite side. He thought that America should be agrarian. He thought bankruptcy was a way that creditors would take away farms from farmers who had borrowed money and couldn't pay it after a bad season, with a weak harvest. This went all the way through the 19th century, and the history was just fascinating to me. The other reason I fell in love with it, I think, is bankruptcy is about meeting people and institutions in a time of great distress. And if your bankruptcy system works well, it can put them in a different place. It can give them a fresh start, as we like to say. And I found that riveting in law school, and I find it riveting today. It was 25 years before I thought it had any connection to Christianity. I'm a little bit of a slow learner, but I eventually came around to the view that it has a lot to do with Christianity.
Well, so explore that, David, because it turns out that debt, and again, the term bankruptcy is not in the scriptures, but debt is throughout the scriptures and throughout Jesus' teaching. And you've told me about just how prevalent Jesus' teaching refers to debt forgiveness. Obviously, there's a lot of parables about that. And then, of course, as I said earlier, his central teaching on prayer references very directly the practice of debt and debt forgiveness. So expand for us just what is the spiritual meaning that you have found in the law around debt and debt forgiveness?
So the short answer to the spiritual meaning is it occurred to me a few years ago, after many years of teaching bankruptcy, that the trajectory of debt and relief from debt is almost exactly the same as the trajectory of the gospel. So when you think about what our bankruptcy system is about, is taking individuals and institutions that have debt that they are not capable of repaying. They're just in too far over their heads. And particularly with particularly with individuals, our bankruptcy system gives them a fresh start. So if you ask the question, what is the gospel about? Well, what the gospel is about is we have rebelled against God. We have sinned. We are incapable of reconciling with God on our own. What we need is a fresh start spiritually, and that's what we have in Jesus. And once that light bulb went off, all of those passages you referred to started kind of appearing to me. So there are the obvious passages in the Old Testament with the Jubilee and the forgiveness of debt after every 7 years. So the forgiveness of all debt and slavery after 7 years, and then the complete Jubilee after 50 years, and then the teachings of Jesus that you referred to. It never occurred to me just how much debt and economics is in his teachings, and the Lord's Prayer, the parable of the ungrateful servant. It really is everywhere, as you said.
Well, it's interesting to me, just kind of pulling on this thread a little bit more. All of that completely makes sense given the human experience. If you think about the way in which debt or economic distress doesn't just weigh on us it does not weigh on us in just a superficial way. It is something that weighs on us in an existential way. What is one of the leading reasons for divorce? Financial stress. What is one of the leading reasons for abortion? Financial concern or financial stress. I mean, what are one of the leading reasons for national crisis? Financial stress. I mean, we just saw Liz Truss in Great Britain. There was an enormous amount of financial stress put on the system. And in a way, she united the United Kingdom more than any other politician has in generations, united them against her. She had about an 8% approval rating. But and we've had on folks to talk about sort of the personal finances as well, because financial distress is something that weighs on people in a deep and profound way. It weighs on you individually. It weighs upon families. It weighs upon nations in a way that is really deep and profound. And so then it makes all the sense in the world that there would be an enormous amount of scriptural attention paid to this. So let's take this into that sort of institutional, national, or in this case, sort of territorial concept. Talk about what has been going on in Puerto Rico. Give us a bit of a primer. What's its legal status? Why do we care? Why should we care? And what's the relationship of debt to the flourishing of the people of Puerto Rico?
Sure. So for starters, Puerto Rico, as most of your listeners will probably know, is a territory of the United States, and that turns out to be quite important for things like having an oversight board, like the board that I'm on. So Puerto Rico is a territory. It has been a territory since 1898. It was acquired by the U.S. In connection with the Spanish-American War in 1898, along with the Philippines, which later became independent, and Guam, has been a territory since then, has gradually been given more rights. So Puerto Ricans became American citizens in 1917 as a result of something called the Jones Act. They were enabled to put in place their own constitution in 1952, but they still are, in many respects, a colony, to use a term that is unfortunately accurate, in the sense that Puerto Ricans do not vote in presidential elections, so they don't have a vote for president. They have a representative in Congress who is known as a resident commissioner and is essentially a congressperson, but that representative does not have a vote on legislation in Congress. So it's a very, very awkward status. What happened with Puerto Rico was Puerto Rico fell into deep financial distress in the early years of this century. So starting in 2006, as a result, in part, of the loss of a tax break that had encouraged pharmaceuticals to go to Puerto Rico. They're still there, but Puerto Rico lost a lot of revenue because they lost a tax break starting through a phase out from 1996 to 2006. They plugged the hole. The Puerto Rico lawmakers plugged the holes in their budget, not by reducing expenses and increasing taxes, but by issuing debt. And so they ended up by 2016 with $70 billion of debt, if you count Puerto Rico and all of the government instrumentalities. In 2015, 2016 is when the legislation that created the board went in place. In 2015, the governor of Puerto Rico said, our debts are not payable. We can't pay them. And that caused Congress to spring into action. Congress put in place the Oversight Board, and Puerto Rico, being a territory, connects up to this. Congress could not do that with a state. But because Puerto Rico is a territory and Congress has sweeping authority under the territories clause of the Article 4 in the Constitution, Congress could do that. They put in place a 7-person oversight board, which, as Curtis mentioned, I've been on since the beginning. And we have 2 major responsibilities. One is to certify 5 or more year fiscal plans and budgets that are consistent with those fiscal plans to try to get the budget in balance and to restructure the debt. And so we spent 5 years restructuring the debt. That restructuring of the island's debt, of Puerto Rico's debt as a whole, was completed in March. It went effective in March. So that was about $35 billion of the debt, more or less, was restructured. So that's that's the primer.
Sorry, and we should probably emphasize that, I think people probably only have a dim awareness of conditions in Puerto Rico and how much they have been hit with natural disasters in recent years. I mean, at least two that I know of, sort of major hurricanes that have devastated the economy. And then you add on to that a crushing debt load. David, what does that do to a people? Like, what does that do to a people and a place to have that kind of, stress placed on it from just natural disasters? And then on top of that, what does this debt load do to a society and to people living in that society? So explain that, and then explain what this restructuring then accomplished.
Yeah, there's a lot in there. So just to start with what you started with and elaborate on it slightly. So the island is very poor and has been poor for a long time. It has a poverty rate of about 40%, a child poverty rate of about 60%, more or less. That 40% poverty rate is compares to the lowest state poverty rate is about 13%. So it's a very poor island, been poor for a long time. It has been battered by natural and not natural disasters. So you alluded to them, just to go through them in one sentence. Hurricane Maria hit in September of 2017, just devastated the island about a year after the board was put in place. 2019, Puerto Rico, late 2018, early 2019 actually it was late 2019, early 2020, had a series of earthquakes. The first one, or the major one initially, was 6.4 on the Richter scale. There was a whole series of them for weeks after, what's called a seismic swarm. In the summer of 2019, there was a scandal involving the governor of Puerto Rico, Ricardo Rosselló. He was forced out as a result of the scandal. In 2020, as with the rest of the country, there was the pandemic that hit Puerto Rico. And then about a month ago, Puerto Rico had another hurricane, Hurricane Fiona, which was not as devastating in its immediate destruction as Hurricane Maria, but flooded a lot of the island and caused lots of problems with electricity and other things. So Puerto Rico has been battered. And the word that's often used to describe the reaction of Puerto Ricans is resiliency, that it's remarkable how resilient they've been. But there's a backlash against that, understandably. People say, we're tired of being resilient. We're tired of having to deal with all of these problems that are on an order of magnitude different than anywhere else in the country. That, I think, is where the restructuring comes in. We obviously, the Oversight Board and working with the government, obviously can't fix everything. But getting the debt down to a manageable level and getting the budgets balanced, hopefully for the long haul, will, I believe, put the Puerto Rico economy in a place where it can grow. So it will create the conditions for really a transformation on the island and an addressing of a lot of these problems. Now, we don't pick industries. We don't say, here's what the future is, there's what the future is. We're just trying to create the foundation for recovery going forward.
So let me, you've really nicely laid out a lot of what, you guys have done and you've accomplished. Here, let me raise a question that I know some listeners are asking to themselves, which is, wait a minute. If a government voluntarily enters into these binding relationships, what kind of message are you sending when you give these generous restructuring plans? Aren't you, and I get from the standpoint of sort of forgive our debts as you forgive our debtors. I mean, I understand like the biblical individual sort of notion of debt forgiveness and forgiveness in general, but that's not really setting a principle of general debt forgiveness. And aren't there a lot of perverse incentives that are established when you say to an institution that has been irresponsible that your irresponsibility is going to not have real consequence? Aren't you putting in place some precedents that could have some real dangers? And shouldn't institutions have to endure the cost of their decisions? So that, I know that there's a lot of folks who might be sort of thinking this through and saying, wait a minute, what's the balance between debt restructuring and relief of the consequences of debt and incentivizing future institutions to sort of take on debt with the thought and the understanding that, well, we've established the precedent that I don't actually endure the consequences of this decision.
Those are all good points and good questions, and we and I do hear that. You hear that both in the individual realm, you hear it in the realm of cities and states and commonwealths like Puerto Rico and nations. And what it distills too often is you have an obligation to make good on your promises. If you've entered into a contract, if you've borrowed money and you promised to repay it, you have an obligation to make good on your promises. That's one way it's often put. David, you put it in terms of incentives as well. If you don't have to make good on that contract or on that promise to repay, maybe you'll borrow lots more money and you won't ever try to repay. I do think that is a legitimate concern. So it seems to me that bankruptcy or debt restructuring is only appropriate if you legitimately can't repay. If it's simply not possible for you to repay, and at that point, if that's the case, it's really not it may not be in anybody's best interest that you be forced to try to keep repaying. You can't get blood from a stone, as people say. And so if someone who is overwhelmed by debt, if there's no opportunity for debt relief, they're going to lose all hope that they're ever going to be able to climb out. They're probably not going to work all that hard to try to repay that debt if they have no hope that they can. And to some extent, I think that is true at a larger level with a state or with a country as well. So the condition, in my view, is you have to legitimately not be able to pay, but if you can't repay, there is room for and a need for an opportunity for a fresh start. And an interesting and counterintuitive thing about this for me is those kinds of arguments are strongest, in my view, with individuals. I think most of us can see why you would want a fresh start, and with public entities like Puerto Rico or like a state or like a country, stronger than they are with, say, a corporation. With a corporation, if it's unable to pay its debts, you can just shut it down. And maybe that's the right result. Don't give it a chance for a fresh start. And sometimes that is the right result. That's not a realistic option with an individual or with a public entity. So I think there's some surprising analogies between individuals who have too much debt and a public entity like Puerto Rico.
I want to explore
one real quick follow-up that I think is interesting about the terms that we use. So we use the term forgiveness of debt. We also use the term forgiveness of sin. Okay. But we don't interpret forgiveness of sin as permission for sin. But we often interpret forgiveness of debt as permission for debt. And I've just sort of thought about that as to why that might be.
Well, I might quibble with the way you're characterizing forgiveness of debt. I think you're exactly right about the way you're characterizing forgiveness of sin. But when we forgive debt, we don't say go out and borrow lots more money.
Right.
Ideally, what we're saying is be more careful next time about the debt that you take on. So I'm not sure exactly what the implication is, but I do think you're right in the sense that when we talk about forgiveness of sin, the opportunity of forgiveness of sin does not mean it's a great thing to go out and sin again. And the Apostle Paul, who I'm sure is in the back of your mind, confronts that directly. He says, if we've got all this grace, if our sin's going to be forgiven, why not just go out and sin all the more? And he says, you don't get it. So you're not really focusing on what forgiveness of sin is about. It's about reconciliation with God. And if you're really reconciled with God, you will want not to sin again. I think that is a little bit different because I think you would say with forgiveness of debt, not so much that you wouldn't want debt again, it's that you wouldn't want to misuse debt again or take the same chances with debt again. And I think the reason for that is that as much as we worry about debt and wish it could go away, and there are some Christian movements that want it to go away, it really is essential to economic life. There are very valuable uses of debt. If you have good prospects, if you're a farmer who has good prospects for a healthy crop in the fall, you might not have the money to buy the seeds in the spring, and there's a role for debt in that. So I think there is a limit to the analogy between debt and sin, I think is what I'm finally getting to. Curtis?
Well, I think there are limits for sure. You can't equate the two, but I'm wondering if there are actually more profound analogies. And let me explore this with you, David, in that when you're dealing with debt and the possibility of forgiveness debt, on the one hand, you've got the problem that David French was just talking about, which is you don't want to create perverse incentives to just say, oh, wait, debt doesn't matter. You can just go ahead and keep incurring more debt. And similarly, you don't want to say you just keep incurring more sin. You want there to be a sense that the weight of debt has actually been felt, right? It's not just been torn away and just like fairy dust has been sprinkled over it and made to disappear. But on the other hand, you really want there to be a genuine second chance, a freedom, an ability to start again and renew and be restored to the fullness of economic and social and life that otherwise debt kind of crushes. And it seems to me in bankruptcy law, you're trying to figure out how to navigate between those two things, right? How do you not just sprinkle fairy dust and pretend this never happened? And on the other hand, how do you actually give genuine relief and a second chance? And that is actually the challenge God faces with human sin, right? That is actually the precise spiritual challenge that is faced. And in Jesus, God comes up with this solution, that God's restructuring of human sin, of the human debt, of the ways in which human beings have broken their vows and covenants and promises to God, is this sort of surprising way, which is the cross. And it strikes me that the cross is actually trying to accomplish both in fullness, that there is a genuine acknowledging, a reckoning of the cost of the debt, of the cost of the sin. There's not fairy dust that's sprinkled over it in which people are told, oh, let's just pretend, Israel's sin, individual sin just never happened. We will just sprinkle this magic solution called grace and we'll just pretend it never happened. No, on the contrary, the cross is displaying the profound consequences of sin and the cost of sin, but the cost is borne by God himself in a personal way. That forgiveness is not a forgetting and a pretend kind of forgetting. It's a real reckoning with it that is borne actually by God himself. And therefore, as a result, that has a new claim on us. That claim of forgiveness doesn't mean we're free to go whatever we want. We've been, as the gospel says, bought at a price. We're now actually kind of indebted to God who has forgiven us our debts. And that ought to actually promote a complete change of our life. That ultimately is freeing. That ultimately frees us to live a new life. And so that's the theological vision of, I think, how forgiveness of sin works. And I have felt like when you've talked to me about how bankruptcy works, part of the beauty and the art of it is you also, in an imperfect way, it's an image, it's not a direct application of the gospel, but it's trying to image God this way of like, okay, we want there still to be a reckoning. And that's why in bankruptcy law, it's not like we just tear up the debt like magically. There's a reckoning line by line and an ordering of what's owed, and then actually there's a distribution of costs that the creditors actually have to bear that cost. But then also similarly, there's a plan in place to actually, like as you say, restructure one's life. To actually, it's kind of like the it's the legal version of trying to image repentance. I'm saying, how do you actually realize that there's a claim on your behavior now, not to keep doing this again? So, David, am I off base there in seeing the kind of resonances there is between sin and debt?
I don't think so. I think you have a great future as a bankruptcy scholar.
Great.
You should throw all this theology stuff overboard or keep some of it and become a bankruptcy scholar. But a couple of thoughts that occurred to me, and I really do think there's a lot to this. And the thoughts center around the question whether there should be more in bankruptcy to make the weight of the debt or the failure to pay the debt felt, to use the kind of term you use. And the first thing I'll say, which is not answering that question, but the first thing I'll say about when people file for bankruptcy, it's often assumed or thought by many folks that it's really easy to file for bankruptcy, and it's just this attractive nuisance. It's a real temptation to go file a bankruptcy petition and get your debts released. But that's not the way it's experienced by people. Debt, as David was saying earlier, it's very destructive to relationships when your finances don't work. When you have too much debt, you have an inability to sustain yourselves. It's destructive of relationships. And so filing for bankruptcy, which does involve a reckoning, is not something that people tend to do lightly as individuals. But the other thing I'll say is it does seem to me that there might be a little bit more room in the bankruptcy system to make sure the weight of inability to pay debt is felt. And the thing that I've toyed with in a little bit of my writing, echoing things people have said in other contexts, is maybe there ought to be a role for apology in bankruptcy, an opportunity for a debtor to apologize to their creditors for breaking the promise that they were going to repay what they're borrowed. Our system is set up to get people in and out of personal bankruptcy as quickly as possible. It's a volume business, to put it in economic terms. But maybe there ought to be a role for apology, not forced apology, but if a debtor wants to apologize to creditors, to say something about what this all means, I think that might be a way to reinforce the weight of what's happened a little bit.
So, what's been the reaction to your work in Puerto Rico? Have you faced withering criticism? Have you earned universal plaudits? Has it been a complete mix of the two?
Well, can I interject also? And can you say a little bit, because you didn't quite say what the restructuring accomplished, in terms of the average individual, how much debt load was reduced, in Puerto Rico? And then I'd love to hear your answer to David's question. Given that I'm sure not everyone was 100% happy with the results, what was the reaction?
And I think I'll answer those in the reverse order to get to what I think is the happy part of it. So starting with the reaction, have we gotten any criticism? I was encouraged, David, when you talked about Liz Truss's approval ratings, because they may be even lower than the Oversight Board's approval ratings. Our approval ratings.
Or yours might be lower than hers, you mean?
I'm hoping they're slightly higher, but it's a pretty close contest, I think. We're not very popular, and we have been attacked for 6 years, not just once or twice, both from the left and from the right. From the left, the attack has been from people who imagine that Puerto Rico can just wipe out all of its debt. And imagine that the only reason that the board is there is to serve as collection agents for the creditors. There have been protests at various points. At one point, summer of 2018, there were wanted ads put all over the University of Pennsylvania campus where I teach, with my picture on them, saying that I'm a member of this board and we are mercenaries taking the blood of ordinary Puerto Ricos to pay Wall Street bondholders. And one of the odd things about this poster is it actually had a pretty good picture of me on it. It would have been easy to find an evil-looking picture. That's not the one they chose. But there is this, there's this idea that the debt could just be wiped out, which you can't do in this country. We have a rule of law that limits what can be done and ensures that creditors are treated fairly. But so we've been attacked from the left for those kinds of reasons and for other reasons. We've been attacked from the left as a colonialist imposition on Puerto Rico. And the reality is that's true. I mean, it is. I believe the board is necessary. I believe the board is going to produce long-term helpful change, but it is an imposition, no question. From the right, we've been attacked by creditors who say Puerto Rico could pay all of its debt, and we shouldn't be restructuring the debt. One hedge fund who had this view was unhappy that we were pushing to restructure the debt. We believed it needed to be significantly restructured and tried to blow up the board. Filed, not literally, but figuratively, filed a lawsuit alleging that the board members had not been constitutionally appointed. We were not appointed in accordance with the appointments clause requirements for federal officials, which are that you be nominated by the president and confirmed by the Senate. That case went all the way up to the Supreme Court, and happily we won. The court concluded that we were not federal officials, we're Puerto Rico officials, but lots of criticism from the right, in a sense, from creditors as well. I believe that what we achieved with the restructuring of Puerto Rico's debt was remarkable and really was fair to creditors as well. We reduced the debt from about $35 billion. Again, this is Puerto Rico's debt, the island as a whole, not its electricity company, not its water company, but the island as a whole. Reduced the debt from $35 billion, more or less, to $7 billion, reduced the annual obligations from up to $4.2 billion down to $1.15 billion. Dramatic restructuring of the debt. Creditors did get paid well. They got paid in addition to this debt, $7 billion in cash. Cash had built up in Puerto Rico as a result of the federal disaster money and the effect that had on the economy, and also the fact that Puerto Rico hadn't been paying its debt. They also got a contingent value instrument that will pay the creditors more if Puerto Rico's economy outperforms, won't pay more if it doesn't outperform what our predictions are. So dramatic restructuring of the debt. No question in my mind that it will be fully sustainable for Puerto Rico going forward. We also restructured Puerto Rico's pension system, shifting it as a part of the restructuring, or completing a shift from defined benefit, where the government makes promises to pay a certain amount in pensions without necessarily funding those promises. Puerto Rico's pension promises were $55 billion unfunded. Shifting that to a 401k kind of approach that will actually be as sustainable going forward. So my hope is that 10 years from now, or 5 years from now, 10 years from now, people will say that oversight board wasn't quite as bad as we thought.
And so, tell me, it seems like you've moved then from this place of thinking theoretically or as an academic about bankruptcy, mixing law. In the last 6 years, you've accomplished this amazing restructuring of debt and applying this. And in fact, I think I read, I don't know if you have it on your fingertips, but translating those numbers, we have a hard time, sort of grasping the scale of those numbers. But in terms of per individual citizen, the debt reduction on an average citizen was quite remarkable, right? From something, I don't have the exact figures. I was just trying to find it, but it's a pretty profound relief that every individual sort of, in the sense that an individual represents kind of the collective share of the debt. It actually does have the sense of like creating a new future. not just in the debt relief, but like you said, in creating a new future of hope for in terms of their pension plan. So that all seems remarkable to me, but I'm curious, in actually doing the hard work of accomplishing that, what did you learn in terms of this transition from just somebody who's thinking about these things to somebody who's actually having to practice it? What insights did you gain from that journey?
I think the main one is just that actually doing things is really hard. I spent 30 years just talking about it, telling Congress what they ought to be doing, telling judges what they ought to be doing, writing all these law review articles and books. And when you get down to actually doing it, it is a lot harder. And I found for myself personally that I could not be quite as much of a purist about a lot of things as I am as a bankruptcy scholar, that the process is messier than you imagined. And I think it's worked, but there are lots of very difficult issues that I hadn't fully thought about. One of which is, what is it like for a federal judge, one person, to be making decisions that determine the fate of 3 million Americans, and also what the democratically elected officials in Puerto Rico can and can't do. And seeing that in action has been encouraging in some ways, because our judge has been very, very mindful of what the implications of what she's doing. The judge in the case is a judge named Laura Taylor Swain, who's a federal district court judge, trial court judge in Manhattan, Southern District of New York. She's been very, very mindful of those issues, but there are really important real world effects everywhere you turn on people's lives. And that's been it's been very, very sobering to me. And the disasters kind of reinforce that. Going out around the island after Hurricane Maria and seeing what people were living with, it just really puts a lot of what we've been trying to do in a very different perspective.
So let's move on from something that I'm going to bet 1% generously of our listeners had an opinion on before the podcast, which was Puerto Rico debt restructuring. And let's move on to something that 99% of our listeners have an opinion on, which is the student debt forgiveness, which is sort of the most prominent debt forgiveness issue that's arisen in the United States in recent years. What's been your perspective on that debate? What's been your perspective, if you've talked about it publicly, on the proposed Biden administration policy, which, to be clear, is in a bit of a state of flux? And one other thing, this is an interesting hybrid podcast. This is like hybrid advisory opinions and good faith, because we've got a lot of law in here. So
we're coming for your advisory opinions turf there, David.
Well, and I'm gonna pull some out of y'all as well. We've already pulled some theology out of Curtis. Now we're gonna pull out of David some of the. Maybe
wait a minute! I just thought I had a promising career in bankruptcy law out of me.
Oh, you do?
So.
You do? One of the issues, as you all know, in the student loan, with the student loan program, is whether anybody has standing to sue, to challenge it, and that's David's neck of the woods. But from a is this a good idea, and particularly from a Christian, how might a Christian think about student loan relief? I think it's a fascinating issue. I have very mixed feelings, I have to say, at the end of the day, and it's important to say, I think, that on many of these issues, I don't believe that there is the Christian answer to it.
Right.
The Christian answer is this is right or this is wrong. On a lot of these issues, and I'm not surprised that y'all are sympathetic to this perspective. There may be better or worse issues. There may be approaches that are profoundly un-Christian, but there's not a single Christian answer. On the pro side, on the this is a good idea thing, and one of the things that's striking to me about the debt relief part of the program in particular, is It echoes the Old Testament Jubilee in some respects. So what was the Jubilee about? The Jubilee was about forgiving debts, returning land to the original owners of the land. One reason for doing that, presumably, is that in the ancient world, land was essential to one's standing in society and being able to make a living, being able to survive. And so the Jubilee was a way to reset things after quite likely they'd gone out of kilter over the course of 50 years. Nowadays, owning land doesn't play quite the same role. Still hugely important, obviously. But if you ask the question, what's the equivalent to owning land? If you were going to reset things that were out of kilter, the debt you owe on developing your human capital, going to college, getting a degree that's going to put you in a position or in a better position in a contemporary society, might be the sort of thing that you would think about. And so from the pro perspective, I think there is an argument that the amount of student loan debt is huge. A lot of student borrowers are probably not able to pay it off. So there's a case for it from that perspective. On the con perspective, I think you would look at things like, is this well tailored to reach people who really can't repay their debt, or is it more promiscuous? It's just kind of everybody. Is $10,000 a sensible amount? For many people, that's just a little bit of their student debt. For many, it is all of it. But it seems like a fairly random number, so you might be concerned about that as well. But I think it's a really interesting issue from a Christian perspective. The final thing that I would throw in is to go back to David's incentives. What kind of incentives does it create if your debt is just released, and also part of the program is a very generous treatment of income, how much income can go forward toward debt going forward. Is that a good idea? What's that going to do to universities as they're thinking about their tuition? Maybe they raise it even more because of this debt relief. So it's a very complicated question, it seems to me. My bottom line would be it seems a little helter-skelter to me. I'm not a huge fan of it, but I also think there's some interesting biblical echoes in it.
I want to ask, go to your point about that there is no one Christian right answer for this piece of law, because it's something that we've talked about in the podcast before, and I think it's important for us to underline here, and it actually explains why we're having you talk about Puerto Rico as well as student debt, even though maybe people may not have much opinion about Puerto Rico. I think it's a great example of a Christian like yourself being called to bring their Christian faith into a profound legal issue that you're faced to wrestle with. And so the larger relevance, I think, for all of us is, how do we bring our Christian faith into our activities that affect other people, and in particular, when we are in a position to pass laws that govern other people who may not share our faith perspectives, right? So, David, you're somebody who is entering in this deliberations over Puerto Rico as a Christian, informed by your faith. You've got sort of the values of both accountability as well as mercy and justice and wanting to give people a second chance. All that is swirling in you as a person, as a Christian. You're not like checking that at the door when you enter the meetings of the Fiscal Control Board. But when you enter that meeting, now you're making decisions and proposing laws that affect many people other than yourself who may not share those faith perspectives. How does that work? How do you, and I'm really interested in your answer, because you've written about this in the past where, you clearly believe that your faith perspectives should almost be like an image guiding you how you approach the law. But you've also written that you're very skeptical of Christians seizing law to enforce their values on a broader populace. So talk us through that, because you've had to wrestle with just how to do that in the context of Puerto Rico. Help us understand, how as Christians do we bring our faith into the realms of law and politics, and how do we need to be careful about using law and politics to enforce our faith?
Starting with the last thing that you referred to, and that is, I would characterize it as what is the appropriate role of the secular law? What should it be used to enforce and not to enforce? I feel very strongly that, and I think this is a Christian perspective, that the law is not the way to usher in the kingdom of heaven. That there is sometimes a temptation to think that the secular law should just replicate morality. If something's immoral, it should be illegal, and we should pass a law to make it illegal, and it should be based on our view of what is immoral and what's not immoral. It's a very odd perspective to have as an evangelical Christian among evangelicals who say that our faith is about grace. It's not about law. It's not about works and works under the law. It's about grace. And I think we often forget that. There is a temptation to somehow imagine if you just pass the right set of laws, you'll solve all of our problems as a society. And that has proven time over history not to be effective. That when you try to do too much with the law, it is very often counterproductive. Prohibition was the classic example, or a classic example in the United States. So my view is there is a difference between God's law and the secular law, and we should be modest about what we try to do with the secular law. As far as Puerto Rico and my involvement in Puerto Rico, I mean, it's been a very privileged. I felt privileged to be involved in something that I think will and can make a difference, and in a way that I can explain in biblical terms. One thing that has come home to me as well, however, through this process is the importance of humility about that. So as I've thought about things historically, we have an unfortunate history of imperialism in this country that has involved Christians going to other countries and thinking that we're going to make them into a godly country in our image, often doing things that were harmful rather than hurtful. So one of the things that I've become increasingly mindful in with my work in Puerto Rico is the need to be humble about what we're doing, and not to think that somehow I'm a gringo savior, because I'm not. I'm a flawed person who's doing the best I can with the tools that I have. So, and I think those 2 points, I think they go together. I think we should be modest about what we try to do with the law. And I think we should work on humility about ourselves and the role that we play.
I think that note about humility, which is really singing our song on this podcast, is a really important qualifier and a really important thing to remind folks who a great many of Christians in this country kind of look at politics like this. And this is something that I grew up with, and that is Christians in charge means justice, rolls down from the heaven. Justice rolls down from DC, right? And that a lot of the sense of a lot of campaigning, a lot of political argument is sort of identity based, that says, okay, you should elect me because I am a Christian, or you should elect even this non-Christian person like a Donald Trump, because there's going to be an open door for evangelicals in the highest levels of government. And if you have these folks with this identity, then therefore good things are going to flow from that. And, one of the things I think that's really interesting about what you're saying is, well, wait a minute. Okay, there are aspects of my Christianity that hopefully really do inform the way I approach this. And one of those aspects is humility, ideally, that's going to give us an open heart and an open mind. But there's nothing specifically about being a Christian that's going to make you a better expert on Puerto Rico debt relief, better qualified to sort of, and to extend it beyond debt relief, better qualified to understand what are the limits of Putin's nuclear blackmail in Ukraine, or what are the, and when we substitute in that identity-based reasoning for actual knowledge, temperance, wisdom, expertise, etc., we're doing a real disservice to the body politic. If you go back to the morning of January 6th, 2021, the White House Chief of Staff, outspoken evangelical, one of Donald Trump's key leaders in his legal team, outspoken evangelical, the senators who were about to vote to raise objections to the certification of the election results, outspoken evangelicals, the majority of Congress, members of Congress who were going to vote of the House, who were going to vote to not certify the election, outspoken evangelicals. Did justice rain down from the heavens, or did debris as the mob assaulted the Capitol? And, that's one of the problems with this sort of identity-based, and I don't have a question here. I'm more ranting. But you raised a reason for, you gave me the pretext for the rant. And so,
okay, I've got a question for David.
No, I'm not done. No, go ahead.
Are you not done with your rant? Go.
No,
okay, sorry. I thought you were done. I took that as
I
took that as a rant pause. So last question for you, David. Among the many things I admire about you, in addition to your deep thoughtfulness as a Christian, your deep expertise as a lawyer, the fact that you've actually implemented your ideas or tried to implement your ideas humbly in the world in Puerto Rico, is I'm going to add a fourth funky thing about you. You're a poet. You have written poetry.
What?
And written, yes. And so, David, just bring us home with, like, why are you a poet while also being a lawyer? What's the connection between practicing poetry and teaching law? You have an article on this subject, as a matter of fact. So help us, bring us home with this interesting little twist.
Well, thanks for asking that question. And in a sense, the poetry and the fact that I write poetry is taking me back to my first love. That's where I started back when I was in college, and what I was studying in college. The answer that I would have given 10 years ago to the question, how does poetry fit in, and did give in some articles that I wrote. And the reason that I would give this answer is because I had stopped writing poetry. So for 30 years, as I was developing my law professor career, I was writing very unpoetic law review articles and things of that sort. And so what I would have said is that there's some very interesting connections between how we think about and address law on the one hand and poetry on the other. So there's a movement in legal academia, or was a movement, called Law and Literature. And one of the interesting insights of it was an argument that judicial opinions are like poems, and that a really well-written judicial opinion, like a really well-written lyric poem, takes opposing ideas, the perspective of the plaintiff and the defendant, fully addresses and realizes them, and then produces something from them that captures the essence of each, often in a paradoxical way. And there's a whole body of mid-20th century literary criticism called the New Criticism that makes those kinds of arguments about poetry. So there's some interesting connections between poetry and law, and I've written about those. But after Hurricane Maria, and after going to the island and seeing some of the effects of the hurricane, I started writing poems again. And so I think what you would say, if you were trying to explain it, is it was the only way I knew to try to make sense of what I was seeing and doing. The reality is I just started writing poems again. And since then, I've written 10 poems, all of which have a connection to the Puerto Rico situation. One of them was published in Commonweal earlier this year as a poem about Hurricane Maria. I'm not sure if I've answered your question or just circled around it, but it kind of brings me back to where I started. And there is something about poetry that expresses the human condition differently than anything else. And it's not surprising at all from that perspective that so much of the Bible is poetry. And we often forget that, I think.
I love that. I think there's a way in which that poetry can grasp at human suffering in a way that, the law obviously simply cannot express or address. And so it's not surprising to me that after coming close to the human suffering of the situation that you were supposed to try to deal with, you could only find recourse at some existential level through poetry. I think that's beautiful.
On that wonderful note, let's wind down this podcast. We've gone a little long, but that's totally fine because it's fascinating. It's a fascinating conversation. And really appreciate David joining us. And David, it's good to see you again. It had been years and years and years. So it's wonderful to see you. And listeners, as always, thanks so much for tuning in. Please rate us. Please subscribe. Check out Curtis's work at redeemingbabel.org, mine at thedispatch.com. And we'll be back next weekend.